Billionaire CEO insults a black waitress until he realizes she's the daughter of the investor he needs. The Pinnacle wasn't just a restaurant. It was a testament to the sky-high ambitions of Chicago itself. Perched on the 95th floor of one of the city's tallest skyscrapers, it was a world suspended in glass and hushed reverence. The sprawling city lights below twinkled like a fallen galaxy, a silent, glittering kingdom laid at the feet of the men who dined here. The air was perfumed with the scent of truffle oil and quiet power, and the gentle melody of a live pianist served as the discreet soundtrack to deals that could reshape industries. At the most coveted corner table, a fortress of panoramic views, Marcus Thorne clicked to the final slide of his presentation. His voice was a finely tuned instrument of confidence, each word polished, each statistic delivered with the unshakable certainty of a man who believed he was inventing the future. At 38, he was the self-made titan of the tech world, a wunderkind who had clawed his way up from a two-bedroom house in the suburbs to this very apex. His company, Synapse Dynamics, was poised to revolutionize data processing, and this dinner was the final crucial step to securing the capital to do it. And so, Marcus concluded, his gaze locking with the man seated opposite him, with a Series B injection of $500 million, we're not just projecting a 30% market share within 3 years, we're projecting the new industry standard. He closed his laptop with a soft final click. The performance was over. Across the table, Samuel Jones remained silent. At 68, Samuel was a legend in the investment world, a quiet, almost mythical figure who operated not on trends, but on character. He was known for his uncanny ability to see the soul of a company, to invest in the integrity of a founder as much as the innovation of their product. His presence was understated, a simple, dark suit, a lifetime of wisdom etched in the lines around his eyes. But his silence carried more weight than the loudest pronouncements of other men. He had listened to Marcus's pitch for 2 hours without interruption, his expression a calm, unreadable mask. It was in this tense, expectant quiet that Lena Washington approached their table. At 27, she moved with a practiced, almost invisible grace, her crisp white shirt and black apron a uniform of quiet competence. Her hair was pulled back in a neat, low bun, and her eyes, though observant, were carefully kept downcast. This was her role, to be a seamless, silent part of the restaurant's flawless machinery. In her hand, she held a crystal carafe of chilled water. She moved to Marcus's side first, leaning in to refill his glass. It was a movement she had performed 1,000 times, a simple act of service. But at that precise moment, Marcus, eager to emphasize a final point, gestured expansively with his hand. His cufflink, a glint of gold and onyx, brushed against the carafe. It was a tiny, fractional contact, but it was enough. A single, perfect drop of water escaped the spout, arcing through the air and landing with a soft, almost imperceptible tick on the corner of the top page of Marcus's printed proposal. The drop was no larger than a dime, but on the pristine, laser-printed paper, it bloomed instantly into a small, dark blemish. The world seemed to stop. The pianist's melody faded into the background. The low hum of the city below seemed to fall silent. Marcus's head snapped toward Lena, his friendly, ambitious facade vanishing in an instant, replaced by a flash of pure, undiluted irritation. "Be careful, will you?" he snapped, his voice a low, sharp crack in the room's serene atmosphere. The words were loud enough for the occupants of the 2 adjacent tables to turn their heads. "Do you have any idea what these papers are worth?" Lena froze, the carafe still in her hand. The blood rushed to her cheeks, a hot, unwelcome flush of humiliation. She saw the scene as if from outside her own body, the powerful CEO, the silent investor, and the clumsy waitress. It was a perfect, ugly tableau of the world's rigid hierarchy. She quickly placed the carafe on her service tray and reached for a clean linen napkin. "I am so sorry, sir," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur as she gently blotted the small, damp spot. "It was entirely my fault." She worked quickly, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The paper was barely marked now, the water absorbed, leaving only a faint, almost invisible ripple in the page. But the damage was done. The spell of the evening had been broken. Marcus watched her, his jaw tight with an annoyance that was far out of proportion to the minor incident. To him, this wasn't about a drop of water. It was an interruption, an imperfection in a performance he had spent months rehearsing. It was a reminder of a world of small, clumsy mistakes he had fought so hard to leave behind. When she was finished, Lena stepped back, her eyes still lowered. "My apologies again, sir." She retreated from the table, her movements as silent and graceful as when she arrived. Marcus let out an exasperated sigh and turned back to his guest, forcing a smile. "My apologies, Samuel. It's impossible to find good help these days." He expected a nod of agreement, a shared moment of upper-class commiseration. But Samuel Jones said nothing. He simply sat there, his unreadable gaze having shifted from the now perfect proposal on the table to the retreating figure of the young waitress. And in that silent, unwavering gaze, a quiet, momentous judgment was already beginning to form. Marcus Thorne's world was a fortress built on sheer will and relentless ambition. He hadn't been born into the hushed privilege of the Pinnacle's dining room. His childhood had been a landscape of beige tract houses in the sprawling Chicago suburbs, defined by the constant low hum of anxiety from a father who worked 2 jobs and a mother who stretched every dollar until it screamed. The memory of that insecurity was a constant spur, driving him forward, upward, always. He had started Synapse Dynamics from a cluttered garage, fueled by ramen noodles and $600 servers. He coded through sleepless nights, fought off predatory competitors, and outmaneuvered skeptical investors. Every victory had been hard-won, every step up the corporate ladder stained with the sweat of sheer, unadulterated effort. He was a self-made man, and in his worldview, that made him superior to anyone who hadn't endured the same crucible. This philosophy had forged him into a formidable, albeit ruthless, CEO. He believed that the world rewarded strength, punished weakness, and that compassion was a luxury that only those at the very top, safely ensconced in their billions, could afford. For Marcus, kindness was often a veiled form of manipulation, a soft hand hiding a sharp knife. He valued efficiency, directness, and an unyielding commitment to results. Anything else was simply clutter. His relentless drive had come at a cost. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of his obsession. His relationships were transactional, defined by utility rather than genuine connection. He saw people as data points, as resources, as obstacles, or, in the case of Lena, as an irritating interruption to his carefully choreographed ascent. This dinner with Samuel Jones was the culmination of everything he had sacrificed. Jones, the legendary Oracle of Chicago, rarely invested in tech startups. His portfolio was a tightly guarded secret, known for long-term, ethical plays in established industries. Securing his backing, not just for the 500 million, but for the implicit moral endorsement, would catapult Synapse Dynamics into the stratosphere. It would solidify Marcus's position not just as a successful entrepreneur, but as a legitimate force, one even the old guard would have to respect. He glanced at Samuel Jones again, who had resumed his silent, almost meditative posture. Marcus tried to read the older man's expression, searching for a hint of approval, a flicker of admiration for his tenacity. But Samuel's face remained a serene, impenetrable mask. He respects strength, Marcus thought, trying to reassure himself. He'll see my drive, my ruthlessness as a sign of a winner. His strategy for the evening had been carefully calibrated. He had presented his vision with unassailable logic. His numbers were impeccable, but he had also woven in subtle demonstrations of his alpha status. The crisp, authoritative tone, the dismissive gestures, the casual disregard for anything he deemed beneath him. The incident with Lena, though unplanned, fit perfectly into this narrative. It showed he wouldn't tolerate imperfections, that he commanded respect without asking. Marcus believed Samuel would appreciate this. He imagined the older man, a survivor of a different, perhaps even more brutal, corporate landscape, nodding inwardly at his uncompromising nature. He saw Samuel as a reflection of the man Marcus himself aspired to be, powerful, respected, and utterly unburdened by sentiment. Lena, with her quiet apology and her careful movements, was merely a backdrop, a fleeting prop in his grand performance. She represented the past he had escaped, the vulnerability he had shed. He couldn't conceive of her as anything more. He saw her uniform, her quiet demeanor, and instantly categorized her. The help. A problem to be managed, an inconvenience to be dismissed. He failed to consider that Samuel Jones, a man who built his legacy on seeing what others missed, might be using an entirely different set of metrics. He failed to see that Lena's quiet dignity, far from being a sign of weakness, was a testament to a different kind of strength, one Samuel understood intimately. In his relentless pursuit of power, Marcus had become profoundly, terrifyingly blind. He saw the gleaming towers of his future, but had lost sight of the fundamental human connections that truly gave life its worth. He saw Lena's uniform, but completely missed the quiet, discerning gaze of the legendary investor who was, in his silent observation, already deciding Marcus's fate. He believed he was showing strength, but in fact, he was simply revealing the raw, unaddressed wounds of his own insecurity. And he was about to pay a very high price for it. For Lena Washington, the choreography of service was a form of art. Each movement was precise, each interaction a study in quiet efficiency. But beneath the starched uniform and the professional deference was a mind trained not in hospitality, but in the nuances of history and beauty. With a degree in art history from the University of Chicago, she had learned to see the details others missed, the subtle brushstrokes that revealed an artist's true intent, the hidden symbols in a Renaissance masterpiece, the story told by the cracks in ancient pottery. Now, she applied that same discerning eye to the living, breathing art of human interaction. Her presence at the pinnacle was no accident, no tragic tale of a graduate forced into a low-wage job by a bad economy. It was a deliberate choice, the final and most challenging assignment in a multi-year curriculum designed by the one man she trusted implicitly, Samuel Jones. He was not just her benefactor, he was her father, not by blood, but by a bond forged in loss and rebuilt in love. Samuel had taken her in at the age of 10, after a tragic accident had claimed both her parents, who had been his close friends. He had raised her not as an heiress to his fortune, but as a student of the world. He had filled their quiet home with books, music, and long conversations about philosophy, ethics, and the true meaning of a well-lived life. She remembered one afternoon, years ago, sitting with him in the sun-drenched library of their home. She had been lamenting a history textbook that focused only on kings and generals, ignoring the lives of the common people who built the world. Samuel had listened patiently, then closed her book and looked at her with his steady, thoughtful gaze. "You can't understand the worth of $1, Lena," he had said, his voice a low, warm rumble, "or the soul of a person, if you only ever look down from the top of a tower. You have to know what the ground feels like." That conversation had been the genesis of her practical exercise. After she graduated, instead of accepting a position at a prestigious museum or auction house, she had agreed to his proposal. 2 years working in the service industry, a year in a bustling no-frills diner, and a year here at the absolute zenith of luxury. It was a journey designed to teach her what no textbook could: the unvarnished truth of human character, revealed in the moments when people thought no one of consequence was watching. This dinner, she knew, was her final exam. Samuel hadn't told her the guest's name, only that he was a young, brilliant, and ruthless CEO, a man who represented a new, aggressive form of capitalism that Samuel found both fascinating and troubling. "I want to see what he's made of," Samuel had told her, "but more importantly, I want to see how you stand in the face of it." From her vantage point, moving silently around the periphery of the table, Lena saw Marcus Thorne not just as an arrogant man, but as a textbook case of raw insecurity masked as aggression. She saw the way his eyes flickered to Samuel after every boast, seeking an approval he was too proud to ask for. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the desperate need to dominate the space. He wasn't a predator, she realized. He was a man terrified of once again becoming the prey. And she understood, with a sudden, piercing clarity, Samuel's true purpose for this evening. He wasn't just vetting a potential investment. He was conducting a character test, and Marcus Thorne was only one of the subjects. The other was her. Her role was not to be a victim. It was to be the constant, the control variable in Samuel's quiet experiment. Her test was not to fight back, not to reveal her own power, but to endure, to maintain her dignity in the face of disrespect, to be the unshakable testament to a different kind of strength. She looked across the room at Samuel, who sat listening, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. But she knew him. She saw the subtle, almost imperceptible focus in his eyes. He wasn't just watching Marcus. He was watching her. He was measuring her poise, her patience, her silent strength. Lena picked up an empty water glass, her movements fluid and sure. She was not just a waitress. She was the final piece of the test, and her unflinching dignity was the answer key. For Lena Washington, the choreography of service was a form of art. Each movement was precise, each interaction a study in quiet efficiency. But beneath the starched uniform and the professional deference was a mind trained not in hospitality, but in the nuances of history and beauty. With a degree in art history from the University of Chicago, she had learned to see the details others missed, the subtle brushstrokes that revealed an artist's true intent, the hidden symbols in a Renaissance masterpiece, the story told by the cracks in ancient pottery. Now she applied that same discerning eye to the living, breathing art of human interaction. Her presence at the pinnacle was no accident, no tragic tale of a graduate forced into a low-wage job by a bad economy. It was a deliberate choice, the final and most challenging assignment in a multi-year curriculum designed by the one man she trusted implicitly, Samuel Jones. He was not just her benefactor, he was her father, not by blood, but by a bond forged in loss and rebuilt in love. Samuel had taken her in at the age of 10 after a tragic accident had claimed both her parents, who had been his close friends. He had raised her not as an heiress to his fortune, but as a student of the world. He had filled their quiet home with books, music, and long conversations about philosophy, ethics, and the true meaning of a well-lived life. She remembered one afternoon, years ago, sitting with him in the sun-drenched library of their home. She had been lamenting a history textbook that focused only on kings and generals, ignoring the lives of the common people who built the world. Samuel had listened patiently, then closed her book and looked at her with his steady, thoughtful gaze. "You can't understand the worth of $1, Lena," he had said, his voice a low, warm rumble, "or the soul of a person, if you only ever look down from the top of a tower. You have to know what the ground feels like." That conversation had been the genesis of her practical exercise. After she graduated, instead of accepting a position at a prestigious museum or auction house, she had agreed to his proposal: 2 years working in the service industry. A year in a bustling, no-frills diner, and a year here at the absolute zenith of luxury. It was a journey designed to teach her what no textbook could: the unvarnished truth of human character, revealed in the moments when people thought no one of consequence was watching. This dinner, she knew, was her final exam. Samuel hadn't told her the guest's name, only that he was a young, brilliant and ruthless CEO, a man who represented a new, aggressive form of capitalism that Samuel found both fascinating and troubling. "I want to see what he's made of," Samuel had told her. "But more importantly, I want to see how you stand in the face of it." From her vantage point, moving silently around the periphery of the table, Lena saw Marcus Thorne not just as an arrogant man, but as a textbook case of raw insecurity masked as aggression. She saw the way his eyes flickered to Samuel after every boast, seeking an approval he was too proud to ask for. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the desperate need to dominate the space. He wasn't a predator, she realized. He was a man terrified of once again becoming the prey. And she understood, with a sudden piercing clarity, Samuel's true purpose for this evening. He wasn't just vetting a potential investment. He was conducting a character test, and Marcus Thorne was only one of the subjects. The other was her. Her role was not to be a victim. It was to be the constant, the control variable in Samuel's quiet experiment. Her test was not to fight back, not to reveal her own power, but to endure, to maintain her dignity in the face of disrespect, to be the unshakable testament to a different kind of strength. She looked across the room at Samuel, who sat listening, his face a perfect mask of neutrality. But she knew him. She saw the subtle, almost imperceptible focus in his eyes. He wasn't just watching Marcus, he was watching her. He was measuring her poise, her patience, her silent strength. Lena picked up an empty water glass, her movements fluid and sure. She was not just a waitress, she was the final piece of the test, and her unflinching dignity was the answer key. Lena did not bend, she did not stoop. In the face of Marcus Thorne's naked act of humiliation, she responded with a grace so profound it was, in itself, a form of defiance. Instead of immediately reaching for the fallen fork, she first addressed the primary issue. "Of course, sir. I will have a new steak prepared for you to the correct temperature right away," she said, her voice a calm, professional murmur. With a deft, almost imperceptible movement, she lifted his plate from the table, ensuring the rest of his meal would be kept warm while the new order was fired. Then, and only then, did she address the fork on the floor. She didn't kneel. She took a small, clean side plate from her service tray and a pair of silver tongs. With a quiet, fluid motion, she bent slightly at the knees, a gesture of professional necessity, not of subservience. She used the tongs to lift the sullied fork, placing it onto the clean plate with a soft click. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. Her actions were economical, precise, and utterly devoid of the shame Marcus had intended to inflict. She straightened up, holding the plate with the used fork. "I will bring you a fresh setting immediately, Mr. Thorne," she said, her eyes meeting his for a brief, fleeting moment. In that gaze there was no anger, no fear, no pleading. There was only a calm, impenetrable dignity. Then she turned and walked away, her posture perfect, her steps unhurried. The entire exchange had taken less than 30 seconds, but the power dynamic at the table had been irrevocably altered. Marcus had thrown a grenade of contempt, expecting an explosion of emotion, tears, anger, or at the very least, flustered embarrassment. Instead, Lena had caught it, disarmed it with quiet competence, and handed it back to him, its pin still intact, but its purpose utterly defeated. Marcus was left sitting in a stunned, ringing silence. He had made his move, his most aggressive play to demonstrate his dominance, and it had fallen completely flat. He felt a hot flush of something akin to shame crawl up his neck. He had intended to make her look small, but instead he had only succeeded in making himself look cruel and petty. He risked a glance at Samuel Jones. The older man's expression had not changed. He was still watching, his hands resting calmly on the table. But the silence emanating from him was no longer neutral. It was heavy, judgmental, and deeply unnerving. It was the silence of a man who had seen everything he needed to see. Marcus felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He had miscalculated badly. His carefully constructed performance of the ruthless, powerful CEO had been exposed for what it was, a desperate, insecure pantomime. He had tried to impress Samuel with a show of force, but he was beginning to suspect that Samuel valued a different kind of strength entirely, the quiet, unshakable kind that Lena Washington had just displayed in abundance. He cleared his throat, desperate to fill the suffocating silence, to regain some semblance of control. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle and hollow even to his own ears, "you certainly can't fault their training here. Very thorough." Samuel Jones did not respond. He simply picked up his water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down on the table, the soft click of crystal on linen, a deafening indictment. For Marcus, the best dinner of his life had just become the longest. He was trapped at a table with a silent judge and the ghost of his own colossal misjudgment. And as he waited for his perfectly cooked steak to arrive, he had the sickening premonition that he had already irrevocably lost the $500 million deal. What he didn't yet understand was that he was on the verge of losing something far more valuable. Model response. Of course, here is Chapter 6, continuing the narrative for Video S9 and adhering to the established blueprint. Video S9. Chapter 6. The new steak arrived, delivered by a different server, a young man whose hands trembled slightly as he placed the plate before Marcus. Lena did not return to the table immediately, a professional choice that was both a courtesy and a quiet, powerful statement. She was allowing the tension to dissipate, allowing Marcus to sit with the consequences of his own behavior. When she did reappear, it was to clear Samuel's finished plate. She moved with the same serene efficiency as before, her presence a calm, steady rhythm in the strained atmosphere. Marcus, desperate to break the suffocating silence and regain some footing with the inscrutable investor, fumbled for a topic of conversation. He settled on the market, on quarterly earnings, on the predictable, safe terrain of numbers. But Samuel Jones was not interested in numbers. He waited for Lena to step away from the table, then folded his hands and leaned forward slightly. His gaze was no longer a neutral mask. It was direct, analytical, and deeply probing. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice a low, calm baritone that commanded immediate attention. "What is your definition of a person's value?" The question was so unexpected, so completely disconnected from the conversation Marcus had been attempting to start, that it left him momentarily speechless. I'm sorry." Samuel did not repeat himself. He simply waited, his silence an invitation for Marcus to reveal himself. "Value?" Marcus stammered, his mind scrambling to formulate an answer that would impress the man across from him. He fell back on the only language he truly trusted, the language of the boardroom. "Well, I suppose a person's value is determined by their output, their productivity, the tangible results they bring to the table. In my world, value is measurable. It's revenue generated, market share captured, problems solved." He felt a surge of confidence as he spoke, settling back into his familiar role as the hard-nosed, results-oriented CEO. This was solid ground. This was a language Samuel Jones, a legendary investor, would surely understand and respect. Samuel listened, his head tilted slightly, his expression unchanging. When Marcus finished, he simply nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture. "I see," he said, and that was all. He offered no counter-argument, no follow-up question. But the two simple words and the profound, unnerving silence that followed spoke volumes. Marcus had answered the question, but he had failed the test. He felt it in the pit of his stomach. He had laid out his entire worldview, his core philosophy, and it had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. The rest of the meal passed in a state of excruciating tension. Marcus tried to steer the conversation back to the deal, to the revolutionary potential of synapse dynamics, but his words felt hollow, his passion synthetic. He was a salesman whose product had just been fundamentally rejected. He looked at Samuel, trying to read the man, but it was like trying to read a page of blank paper. The investor's calm was absolute, his composure a fortress. Marcus was used to dominating rooms, to setting the pace, to being the center of gravity. But here, at this table, he was utterly powerless. He was being silently, methodically dismantled by a man who had barely spoken a dozen words. He had come to this dinner believing he was the hunter, the predator closing in on a prize. He now realized, with a dawning, sickening horror, that he had been the prey all along. And the trap had not been sprung with a loud, violent snap, but with a quiet, simple question about the nature of human worth. A question he had answered with the chilling, unthinking cruelty of a man who had long ago forgotten the difference between a balance sheet and a soul. Panic, Marcus Thorne had always believed, was a fatal flaw. It was an emotion for the weak, the unprepared. But as he sat in the suffocating silence of Samuel Jones's judgment, he felt the first cold tendrils of it coiling in his gut. He was losing the room, losing the deal, losing the narrative. He needed to reclaim it, to pivot, to demonstrate a different kind of strength. The kind that showed he was not just a ruthless executive, but a decisive one. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he doubled down on the very quality he believed had brought him this far, his unapologetic toughness. "You know, Samuel," he began, forcing a confident, man-to-man tone, "one of the hardest lessons I learned building Synapse was that you can't be afraid to make the tough calls. Sentiment is the enemy of progress." Samuel remained silent, his gaze steady, giving Marcus the rope he needed to hang himself. "Just last month," Marcus continued, launching into a rehearsed anecdote he often used to impress venture capitalists, "we had a lead engineer, brilliant guy, but he missed a critical deadline on a beta launch. Just by a day. The team was devastated. They all liked him. They begged me to give him another chance." He paused, looking at Samuel for a sign of agreement, for a nod of understanding from one leader to another. He received nothing. "But I couldn't," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of somber, manufactured regret. "I had to let him go, on the spot. It sent a message to the entire company. The standard is the standard. There are no exceptions. It was brutal, yes, but it was necessary. You have to be willing to cut away the dead weight to keep the ship moving forward." He leaned back in his chair, a faint, self-satisfied smile on his lips. He had laid his cards on the table. He had presented himself as a decisive, unsentimental leader, a man who prioritized the health of his company above all else. He was a general willing to make sacrifices for the greater good. This, he was certain, was a quality Samuel Jones would respect. He did not realize that he was not describing leadership. He was confessing to a profound character flaw. He was admitting that he saw people not as assets to be nurtured, but as disposable components in his corporate machine. He was boasting about his lack of empathy as if it were a virtue. Samuel Jones's expression did not change, but Lena, who had returned to quietly refill their water glasses, heard every word. She saw the story for what it was. Another performance, another attempt by Marcus to project an image of strength to mask his own deep-seated fear of failure. She moved with her usual quiet grace, but as she reached Samuel's side, she did something almost imperceptible. She noticed a tiny crumb on the pristine white tablecloth near his plate. With a small, discreet gesture, she used the edge of her clean service napkin to brush it away, a simple act of care and attention to detail that stood in stark, silent contrast to the story of casual human disposal Marcus had just finished telling. The gesture was small, almost invisible. Marcus didn't see it, but Samuel did. He saw in that one quiet action a philosophy of care that was the complete antithesis of Marcus Thorne's worldview. It was a philosophy that noticed the small imperfections and sought to correct them, not with brutal cuts, but with quiet, meticulous attention. It was the philosophy of a builder, not a demolisher. Marcus, oblivious, continued to wait for Samuel's validation. He was so caught up in the echo of his own voice, so convinced of the power of his own narrative, that he failed to notice the silent, damning evidence that was accumulating against him with every word he spoke and every action he failed to see. He believed he was showcasing his strength, but he was only succeeding in highlighting the vast, empty chasm where his humanity should have been. The final course of the evening arrived. a delicate construction of chocolate and raspberry that was more art than dessert. Lena placed the plates with the same quiet precision she had shown all evening, her movements a study in practiced elegance. As she set Samuel's dessert before him, she did so with a straightforward, respectful grace. But when she placed the plate in front of Marcus, she performed a small, almost microscopic act of professional perfection. She gave the plate a quarter turn, a subtle rotation that aligned the intricate hand-painted pattern on the porcelain with Marcus's direct line of sight. It was an infinitesimal detail, a flourish of service so refined that 999 out of 1,000 patrons would never notice it. It was the mark of someone who didn't just perform a job, but who inhabited it with a deep, intrinsic respect for the craft itself. It was the kind of detail that spoke not of training, but of an innate understanding of aesthetics and care, a detail more suited to a museum curator than a waitress. Marcus, lost in his own simmering anxiety, saw nothing. He was a man staring at a forest who had long since forgotten how to see the individual leaves. But Samuel Jones saw everything. He saw the subtle rotation of the plate. He saw the intention behind it, the quiet, professional pride. And he saw, with a clarity that was both satisfying and deeply disappointing, the final, irrefutable data point in his character assessment of Marcus Thorne. He had spent the evening watching the young CEO's every move, listening to his every word. He had watched him boast, posture, and perform. He had watched him inflict a casual, thoughtless cruelty upon another human being in a desperate attempt to project his own strength. And now, he had just watched that same human being, in the face of that cruelty, respond not with anger or submission, but with an act of quiet, unassailable excellence. Samuel's smile, when it finally came, was the first genuine expression he had allowed himself all evening. It was not a smile of warmth or amusement. It was the quiet, knowing smile of a man whose hypothesis had just been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. He had come to this dinner to vet a potential investment. He had come to see if Marcus Thorne was the kind of man he could entrust with $500 million of his capital. And now he had his answer. The answer wasn't in the profit projections or the market analysis. It wasn't in the revolutionary potential of synapse dynamics. The answer was in the stark, damning contrast between two individuals. The man who saw the world as a stage for his own ambition, and the woman who, even when treated as invisible, still took the time to ensure the art on a plate was perfectly aligned for the man who had just tried to erase her. It was the contrast between a man who valued only what he could conquer and a woman who valued the quiet, intrinsic worth of doing a job, any job, with unwavering dignity. Samuel Jones knew with an absolute certainty that settled in his bones on which side of that divide he would place his trust, his capital, and his faith. The test was over. The verdict was in. All that remained was the sentencing. The end of the dinner was now in sight, and with it came Marcus's final desperate gambit. Convinced that his performance of ruthless leadership had somehow been too subtle, he decided on one last, unambiguous display of financial dominance. He needed to leave Samuel Jones with a final, indelible impression of his power, his wealth, and his utter command of the world he inhabited. As Lena approached the table to offer coffee, Marcus signaled her to stop. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick, monogrammed leather wallet. From it, he extracted a crisp $100 bill. He did not hand it to her. He held it between his thumb and forefinger for a moment, letting the candlelight glint off the presidential portrait. Then, In a gesture of profound, calculated contempt, he crumpled the bill into a tight, disrespectful wad in his fist. He tossed the crumpled bill onto the table, where it landed with a soft, ugly thud next to the remnants of his untouched dessert. "For you," he said, his voice a low, dismissive drawl. He didn't look at her. He was speaking to Samuel, his every action a piece of theater for the older man's benefit. "Maybe that's enough to help you learn how to do your job properly." The act was a declaration. It was a final, brutal summary of his entire worldview. It said, "Your labor has a price, and I am the one who sets it. Your dignity is a commodity, and I can purchase it, crumple it, and discard it at will. You are not a person to be respected. You are a service to be bought." He had intended it as the ultimate power move, a final flourish of his financial superiority. He believed it would show Samuel that he was a man who understood the value of $1 and was not afraid to use it to enforce his standards. But the silence that followed was not the respectful awe he had anticipated. It was a silence that was cold, sharp, and utterly damning. Lena stood by the table, her hands held loosely at her sides. She looked at the crumpled bill on the pristine white tablecloth. She looked at Marcus, at the smug, self-satisfied look on his face. Then her gaze shifted and met Samuel's. For the first time that evening, a silent, direct communication passed between father and daughter. In her eyes, there was not a flicker of hurt or anger. There was only a quiet, steady resolve. She was not a victim seeking rescue. She was a partner, awaiting a signal. Samuel held her gaze for a single, long moment. He saw in her the reflection of his late wife's strength, the echo of his own deepest-held principles. She had passed the test not just with dignity, but with a grace that was, in itself, a form of power. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The lesson was complete. The experiment was over. The quiet understanding that passed between them was the final, invisible transaction of the evening. It was a transfer not of funds, but of power. And it was a power that Marcus Thorne, with all his ambition and all his wealth, could not even begin to comprehend. He had played his last, best card, and in doing so had revealed a hand that was not just weak, but morally bankrupt. And the man holding all the aces was about to quietly, devastatingly end the game. Lena did not pick up the money. She did not acknowledge it. The crumpled $100 bill lay on the table like a piece of trash, an ugly testament to the man who had thrown it there. Her silence was more powerful than any retort, a quiet, profound refusal to participate in her own degradation. It was Samuel Jones who finally moved. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried an incredible weight. He picked up his linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it beside his plate. The small, precise action was a signal that the performance and the evening were over. He pushed his chair back, the sound a soft, definitive scrape against the polished hardwood floor. For the first time all evening, the serene, unreadable mask dropped from his face, replaced by an expression of cold, clear, and final judgment. He stood, a man whose quiet presence suddenly seemed to fill the entire space. "Mr. Thorne," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the hushed atmosphere of the restaurant with the chilling precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I believe our business here is concluded." Marcus, who had been basking in the glow of his own perceived victory, looked up, startled. The sudden shift in Samuel's demeanor was jarring, unexpected. "Concluded?" Samuel, we haven't even discussed the final terms. I was just about to—" "No," Samuel interrupted, the single word a wall of absolute finality. "I have seen and heard everything I need to." He turned his gaze from Marcus to Lena, and the coldness in his eyes was replaced by a warmth and affection that was so incongruous, so utterly out of place, that it left Marcus momentarily breathless. "Lena," Samuel said, his voice now gentle, paternal, "the lesson is over. You have conducted yourself with a grace and dignity that would have made your mother deeply proud. Are you ready to go home?" The words landed in the silent restaurant with the force of a physical blow. Lena, home. Marcus stared, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before him. Samuel Jones, the legendary investor, the man he had spent 2 hours desperately trying to impress, was speaking to the waitress. Not as an employee, not as a stranger, but as family. The puzzle pieces, which had been misaligned in Marcus's mind all evening, suddenly, violently snapped into place. The shared, knowing glances, the older man's quiet, intense observation, the waitress's impossible composure. It hadn't been an investment meeting, it had been a test, a carefully orchestrated, brutally revealing test. And he, Marcus Thorne, the self-proclaimed master of the universe, had not just failed, he had spectacularly, catastrophically, and publicly self-destructed. The silence that had been his weapon all evening now became his cage, and Marcus was left to suffocate in the ruin of his own making. The world, for Marcus Thorne, seemed to tilt on its axis. The quiet hum of the restaurant, the distant twinkle of city lights, the very air he was breathing, it all felt unreal, part of a surreal, nightmarish play in which he had just been revealed as the fool. "Lena," he managed to choke out, the name feeling foreign and heavy on his tongue. He looked from her calm, composed face to Samuel's implacable one, his mind refusing to accept the reality of what was happening. Samuel did not leave immediately. The sentencing, it seemed, required a final, public pronouncement. He reached into his own wallet, a simple, unadorned leather piece, and extracted a business card. He placed it on the table, not near the crumpled bill, but in the clean, empty space where Lena's hand had been moments before. "Young man," he said, his voice now carrying the quiet, almost weary authority of a judge delivering a verdict he had long since decided. "You have worked very hard tonight. I believe you've earned this." The gesture was a perfect, devastating mirror of Marcus's own, yet it was the complete inverse. Where Marcus's had been an act of contempt, Samuel's was an act of profound, cutting irony. It was a dismissal so complete, so total, that it stripped Marcus of the very power he had tried to wield. Then Samuel turned to his daughter. "Lena, my dear," he said, his voice softening once more, "shall we?" He offered her his arm, a gesture of old-world chivalry that, in this context, felt like the closing of a palace gate. "Yes, Dad," she replied, her voice the first hint of warmth she had allowed herself all evening. She took his arm, and together they turned to leave. They walked away from the table, a portrait of quiet, unassailable power. They moved not with the hurried gait of victors, but with the steady, unhurried pace of people who had nothing left to prove. As they passed the adjacent tables, the diners who had been surreptitiously watching the drama unfold now looked away, a collective, silent acknowledgement that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a business dinner gone wrong. They had witnessed a quiet, brutal execution of a man's character. Marcus remained at the table, a solitary figure in a sea of white linen and sparkling crystal. He was frozen, a statue carved from pure, unadulterated humiliation. He looked at the crumpled $100 bill, his pathetic, failed display of dominance. He looked at Samuel Jones's business card, a clean, crisp tombstone marking the death of his ambitions. And he looked at the half-eaten dessert, a sweet, mocking reminder of an evening that had turned so irrevocably bitter. The deal was dead, he knew that. But it was more than that. The story of this night, he realized with a sickening, dawning horror, would not remain in this room. Samuel Jones was a man whose quiet actions echoed through the financial world like thunder. The story of how Marcus Thorne had treated Samuel Jones's own daughter, believing her to be a mere waitress, would become a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and at country clubs from Chicago to Shanghai. It would be a brand, a permanent, indelible stain on his reputation, more damaging than any market crash or failed product launch. He had built his entire identity on being a man who could read the room, who could see the angles, who could dominate any negotiation. And tonight, he had proven, in front of the one man whose respect he craved above all others, that he was utterly, completely blind. He had seen a uniform, and in his arrogance had failed to see the Queen wearing it. Marcus Thorne sat in the wreckage of his own making, the silence of the now empty restaurant pressing down on him like a physical weight. The pianist had long since finished his final mournful chord. The staff, moving with a quiet, almost funereal efficiency, cleared the surrounding tables, their averted gazes a testament to the magnitude of his fall. Each soft clink of silverware, each gentle swish of a tablecloth being removed, felt like another shovel of dirt on the grave of his career. He couldn't bring himself to move. To stand and walk out would be to admit defeat, to accept the finality of what had just happened. So he sat, a solitary king, in a dethroned kingdom, the crumpled $100 bill and Samuel Jones's pristine business card, the mocking symbols of his ruin. Dad? The single word, spoken so softly it was almost a breath, was the only thing that could have pierced the thick fog of his humiliation. He looked up. It was Lena. She hadn't left with Samuel. She stood by the table, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her server's apron now removed. She wore a simple, dark dress beneath it, and without the uniform, she looked different. Younger, yet somehow more poised, her quiet strength now unobscured by the trappings of her role. "What are you still doing here?" Marcus asked, his voice a hoarse, broken rasp. "Come to gloat, to enjoy the spectacle of my complete and utter demolition?" "No," she said, her voice gentle, devoid of the triumph he had expected. "I came back because my father taught me that you don't walk away from a lesson until it's been fully understood." She pulled out the chair opposite him, the one Samuel had occupied, and sat down. The act was so unexpected, so contrary to the rules of victory and defeat, that it left Marcus speechless. "My father," she began, her voice a soft storytelling cadence, "believes that a person's character isn't a fixed point. He believes it's a journey. And sometimes," she paused, her gaze meeting his without a trace of pity or condescension, "the most important part of that journey is the moment you realize you've been walking in the wrong direction." Marcus stared at her, at the impossible grace of this young woman who had every right to despise him, to celebrate his downfall. "He destroyed me," Marcus whispered, the words a raw admission of his own brokenness. "No," Lena corrected gently. He held up a mirror. What you saw in it was your own creation. She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. You talked tonight about cutting away the dead weight to keep the ship moving forward. You see people as disposable components. My father sees them as the ship itself. He believes that a company, a community, a life, it's only as strong as its most vulnerable part. The words were a direct, surgical strike to the core of his philosophy, yet they were delivered not with malice, but with a strange, unnerving clarity. He knew who you were before you even sat down, didn't he? Marcus asked, the question a plea for understanding. He knew your numbers, she replied. He admired your drive, your innovation. He came here tonight hoping to find a partner. But my father doesn't invest in balance sheets. He invests in people. And he needed to see the man behind the numbers. The test, Marcus realized, had never been about him impressing Samuel. It had been about Samuel giving him the opportunity to reveal his own character. It was a test he could only have passed by not knowing he was being tested. Why? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why this elaborate charade? Because, Lena said, and her voice was filled with a quiet, profound sadness. It was the only way to know the truth. People perform for power. They tell you what you want to hear. But how a person treats someone they believe has nothing to offer them, that is the purest reflection of their soul. It's the one truth that can't be faked. She stood, her part in this final, unexpected lesson complete. My father didn't do this to ruin you, Mr. Thorne. He did it in the hope that you might one day decide to rebuild yourself. The choice, as it has been all evening, is yours. She turned and walked away, her footsteps a soft, steady rhythm against the quiet of the empty room. She left him there, alone with the mirror she had held up, with the devastating and perhaps, just perhaps, liberating reflection of the man he had become, and the faint, terrifying possibility of the man he might yet choose to be. The lesson was finally, completely understood. The sun rose over Chicago the next morning, but for Marcus Thorne, the world remained dark. He had not gone home. He had spent the night in the sterile, anonymous luxury of a hotel suite, the kind of place he usually used for closing deals, not for licking wounds. Sleep had been a stranger, his mind a relentless battlefield of replayed moments, of words he wished he could take back, of a silence from Samuel Jones that echoed louder than any shout. By 8 a.m., the first tremors of the earthquake he had caused began to register. His phone, which had been ominously silent, started to buzz. A text from his COO. "Marcus, what the hell happened last night? The rumor mill is on fire. Call me." An email from a board member, its subject line a single, damning word. Urgent. He ignored them. He knew what was happening. The quiet, surgical takedown at the Pinnacle was not meant to be a private affair. It was a message, and the financial world was a small, gossipy village. Samuel Jones had not just declined an investment, he had passed a moral judgment, and in their world, that was a death sentence. He turned on the financial news network. The anchors were already discussing it, their voices a mixture of professional analysis and barely concealed glee. Unconfirmed reports are swirling this morning about a major fallout between tech wunderkind Marcus Thorne and legendary investor Samuel Jones. Sources close to the deal, which was rumored to be in the $500 million range, say that Jones walked away from the table last night after a private dinner, citing fundamental characterological misalignments with Synapse's leadership. characterological misalignments. The phrase was so clinical, so devastatingly precise. It wasn't about numbers or strategy. It was about him. The segment continued, now with a photo of Samuel and a much younger Lena at a university charity event years ago. Adding another layer to this developing story, the anchor said, is the identity of Jones's adopted daughter, Lena Washington, a respected art historian who, sources say, has been conducting a long-term social experiment on the nature of class and service. Marcus switched off the television, the anchor's voice still echoing in the silent room. It was worse than he had imagined. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered. He had been the unwitting subject of an experiment. He had been a lab rat in a cage he hadn't even known existed. The humiliation was a physical thing, a burning in his chest that made it hard to breathe. Then came the call he had been dreading. It was from the chairman of his own board. The voice on the other end was strained, the usual bonhomie gone, replaced by a cold corporate resolve. "Marcus, we have a problem. A big one. 2 of our primary investors have pulled their funding, citing a loss of confidence in executive leadership. The stock is down 17% in pre-market trading. The board is calling an emergency session this afternoon. You need to be there." The words were a formality. He knew what an emergency session meant. It meant his execution. He spent the next few hours in a daze, pacing the hotel room like a caged animal. He had built Synapse Dynamics with his own 2 hands, had willed it into existence through sheer, relentless force. And now it was all slipping through his fingers, not because of a market downturn or a failed product, but because of his own monumental, arrogant stupidity. Because he had failed to see the humanity in a young woman holding a water carafe. When he arrived at the Synapse headquarters that afternoon, the atmosphere in the glass and steel tower was funereal. Employees avoided his gaze, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. In the boardroom, the men and women who had once hailed him as a visionary now looked at him like he was a liability, a stain to be removed. The meeting was short and brutal. There were no accusations, no raised voices. There was only the cold, hard logic of the market. His actions had made the company toxic. His name, once their greatest asset, was now their biggest risk. "The board has voted, Marcus," the chairman said, his voice devoid of emotion. "We are accepting your resignation, effective immediately." And just like that, it was over. The empire he had built, the identity he had forged, the fortress of his ambition, it all crumbled to dust in the space of a single sterile sentence. He walked out of the boardroom, out of the building he had created, and into the harsh afternoon sunlight. He was no longer a CEO, no longer a titan. He was just a man, stripped of his title, his company, and the very foundation of his self-worth. He stood on the crowded Chicago sidewalk, the city he had once thought he owned, now a chaotic, indifferent blur. He had nowhere to go, no one to call. He had spent his life cutting away the dead weight, and now he realized with a soul-crushing clarity that he was utterly, completely alone. The ship was still moving forward, but he was the one who had been cast overboard. Model response. Of course. Here is Chapter 14, continuing the narrative for Video S9 and adhering to the established blueprint. Video S9, Chapter 14. For weeks, Marcus Thorne existed in a self-imposed exile. He retreated to a small, isolated cabin he owned in the woods of Michigan, a place he had once used for strategic getaways, but which now served as a minimalist prison. He cut off all contact, ignoring the frantic calls from his lawyers, the venomous emails from former colleagues, and the relentless buzz of a media world that had already moved on to its next scandal.